Good evening.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Hello. Good evening.
Good evening, Dr. Keaton.
Good evening, Professor Kom.
My name is Dr. Chiji Akom. I'm the chair of the Department of Global Interdisciplinary Studies here in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. And I welcome you to the 2024 Africana Studies Program's Senghor-Damas-Césaire Lecture. This is the program's annual intellectual event that focuses on ideas about continental Africa and its diasporas. This lecture is named for three influential Black intellectuals of the French-speaking world: Léopold Sédar Senghor of Senegal, Léon Damas of French Guiana, and Aimé Fernand David Césaire of Martinique. All three, as French colonial subjects, have met in Paris in the 1930s as students. The trio will later become principal proponents of the Negritude movement, at that time a radical interrogation of the French colonialist project in Africa and its Caribbean diaspora, while also articulating an aesthetic, philosophical, and political ideology that privileged Black intellectual thought, that privileged Black thought and cultural agency. Our lecture is thus named for the celebration of Black letters in the arts and political spheres. I am introducing our lecturer tonight, Dr. Nduka Otiono, with great pleasure. You see, Nduka and I met in graduate school at the University of Ibadan, Nigeria. We both studied under the mentorship of the distinguished scholar of African oral epic and other performance traditions, Professor Isidore Bewo. And since then, Nduka and I have collaborated in many projects, including co-editing the collection of essays, oral literary performance in Africa, Beyond Text, and subsequently serving as guest co-editors for the special edition of the journal Africa Literature Today. The subject of our edition was on African language literatures written in indigenous African languages. Earning his doctorate from University of Alberta, Dr. Otiono is Associate Professor of African Studies and English and the Director of the Institute of African Studies at Carleton University, Canada. Before arriving in Canada on his academic journey for over a decade ago, Otiono was a journalist during the dark years of Nigerian military rule, when just announcing oneself as a member of that profession was an easy call for detention and even worse. At the Post Express, one of the reputable newspapers in Nigeria, in Lagos, he was the founding editor of the literary supplement, which indeed won the literary column of the year in 1997. Then, at the flagship newspaper, the Nigerian Guardian, Nduka Otiono contributed significantly to literary and cultural journalism through that flagship newspaper. A notable alumnus of the Lagos Ibadan School of Poetry, Dr. Otiono is the author of 3 volumes of poetry, including DisPlace, which won the 2023 African Literature Association Book of the Year Award for Creative Writing, and was a finalist for Canada's Archibald Lampman Award for Poetry. He's also the author of a collection of short stories, The Night Hides with a Knife. That's a very strong title, I have to say. The Night Hides with a Knife, which won the Association of Nigerian Authors and Spectrum Publishers Prize for Fiction. At the time it was published in the early 1990s. He has also served as the General Secretary of ANA, of that particular association. Dr. Otiono's research has been published in top-ranked academic journals and he has won several professional and community-based awards. His multidisciplinary research explores the rich tapestry of popular urban narratives in post-colonial Africa, examining how these stories travel through various cultural formations such as oral traditions, the press, movies, popular songs, and social networks. Along those lines, he is the co-editor with Josh Tooth of Polyvocal Bob Dylan, music, performance, literature, a very significant text in many ways, not only because of, the moment, coming right after Bob Dylan, of course, won the prize, the Nobel Prize, but also because of the ways in which he and his co-editor were looking at Dylan's music as literature, as signals and markers toward understanding the kinds of complexities of cultural production across the world. He is also the co-editor of a recent anthology, Nigerian Unbound, an anthology of new Nigerian poets under 40. That book was just published last month by the Griots Lounge Publishing Press in Canada. Today's lecture topic, Unbound Street Stories in a Diasporic World, draws from his forthcoming monograph, Street Stories in Africa, which is under contract with McGill Queen's University Press. Dr. Otiono tags himself a street philosopher. I do know for sure that his varied professional lives as a journalist, writer, scholar, teacher, and cultural activist have made his research one of the most critically received among contemporary African intellectuals in the diaspora, as his numerous awards and recognitions testify. So, without much further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a Villanova robust welcome to Dr. Nduka Otiono.
So for a moment, I wasn't recognizing myself in that very robust introduction. Thanks so much, Chiji, for that. Sorry, my computer is gone to sleep. So we've got to wake it up today. All right. So, good evening, distinguished colleagues and students, and everyone else in the community who have joined us this evening. I'm delighted to be here today and would like to thank Dr. Olakunle T. Owolabi, Associate Professor of Political Science and Global Interdisciplinary Studies and Director of Africana Studies, for inviting me to give this annual Senghor-Damas-Césaire Lecture for Africana Studies for 2024 at Villanova University's Falvey Library. It is particularly noteworthy to me that Dr. Owolabi brings to his role an impressive authority and an impressive achievement that includes the award of the W.E.B. Du Bois Book Award for his recent monograph, Ruling Emancipated Slaves and Indigenous Subjects, by the National Conference of Black Political Scientists in the United States. There is no gainsaying the connection between W.E.B. Du Bois and the remarkable triumvirate, Senghor-Damas-Césaire. And I think scholars who understand the connections between these intellectuals, these powerhouses, would easily recognize that. My gratitude also goes to the Falvey Library for hosting not only this edition of the prestigious lecture, but also the entire series, or perhaps the entire series, because I know that some of them have been held here, or some of the series, let me put it that I thank Jessica Schwartz for coordinating the travel and accommodation arrangements for my trip to Villanova. I acknowledge the encouragement of Dr. Chiji Akoma, my old schoolmate, friend, research collaborator, and faculty member of Villanova University. On a lighter note, the promise of a homemade dinner or the popular Nigerian delicacy, egusi and ando, may not easily sound as an incentive for a serious academic trip. But knowing that my journey to Philadelphia was a bit convoluted, from Ottawa, my base via Toronto, would make a special dinner more priceless and something to look forward to. And indeed, Chiji justified it with the memorable welcome dinner I had at his home last night. Thank you, Chiji Amusowa, for hosting me so sumptuously. Thank you all for creating time to join us for this lecture this evening. In dealing with today's topic, I had a hard time thinking about how to organize this because one, I had committed myself to a very strict title, but at the same time, I also typically like to engage my subject in the most lively way possible because I'm at heart a storyteller and a poet. A fitting epigraph for my lecture is drawn from a Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry that underscores the naming of this series after the iconic intellectuals of African descent, Senghor-Damas-Césaire, and why they matter. And I'm going to quote. It's a little bit of a long quote. Towards the end of his life, MS Césaire declared that the question he and his friend, Leopold Sédar Senghor, came to raise after they first met was, who am I? Who are we? What are we in this white world? And he commented, that's quite a problem. Who am I? Is a question Descartes posed. And the reader of the French philosopher naturally understands such a question to be universal. And the subject who says, I, here to stand for any human being. But when, who am I? Has to be translated to or as, who are we? Everything changes, especially when the we have to define themselves against the world which leaves no room for who and what they are, because they are black folks in a world where universal seems to naturally be white. And then it continues. Negritude, or the self-affirmation of black peoples, or the affirmation of the values of civilization of something defined as a black world, as an answer to the question, what are we in this white world, is indeed quite a problem. Césaire has described his first encounter with Senghor as friendship at first sight, which would last for the rest of their fairly long lives. He has also added that their personal friendship meant the encounter between Africa and the African diaspora. Césaire, Damas, and Senghor had individual lived experiences of their feeling of revolt against a world of racism and colonial domination. I found this quote very, very instructive in many ways and an entry point into my reflections about the title for today's lecture. And I consider the idea of answering the question, who are we? From a cultural studies perspective and by drawing naturally from my eclectic background. For the purpose of full disclosure, I would like to state that this lecture is an extension of two past projects. My earlier work on Street Stories and my African Literature Association public lecture of March 23, 2024, titled Unbound Tongues, New Nigerian Poets, Politics, Disillusionment, and Hope in an Age of Japa. And then we'll get to see what Japa is towards the end of this lecture. For context, more about my background, because this talk is very much tied to my background, and those who are familiar with my work and my writing and scholarship would easily know that I thrive in anecdotes. My scholarship is filled with storytelling, much of it drawn from my personal experiences. So I've enjoyed a professional career spanning 3 decades as a writer, journalist, academic, and cultural activist, as Dr. Chiji Akuma had pointed out in the intro. By the time I pivoted from journalism in Nigeria to a full academic trajectory in Canada in 2006 for doctoral studies at University of Alberta, I published 4 critically acclaimed books and earned a reputation as one of Nigeria's leading literary journalists. Upon my graduation, I moved to Brown University at the invitation of the father of African literature, the Venerable Chinua Achebe, with whom I did a 1-year postdoc and worked as a senior research associate. The prestigious Banting postdoctoral fellowship brought me back to Canada to Carleton University. I have worked on multiple fronts and have produced an integrated body of work informed by my interdisciplinary knowledge and background in the fields of African oral performance, popular cultural production, post-colonial studies, media, and creative arts. Being uniquely located at the intersection of research and scholarship, journalism, and creative writing has allowed me to comfortably straddle these interdisciplinary fields and to contribute significantly to knowledge, especially in African cultural studies and African literature. So the monograph, contrary with McGill Springs University Press, which grew out of my doctoral research, combines theories from media, literature and popular culture, post-colonial studies, and oral performance in Africa with my practical experience as a journalist and creative writer. My professional work and publications are bifurcated into 2 main timelines: as a writer and journalist, and as a full-time academic. So I'm in a second career, as it were. This binary informs the writing and research agenda that I have triangulated as a writer, cultural activist. The hybrid trajectory of my work has included a collaborative book project, Polyvocal Bob Dylan, performance, literature, and music, that has fulfilled a long-term interest in popular culture by focusing on the work of one of the greatest cultural icons of our time, and the first musician, singer, songwriter to win the Nobel Prize for Literature, even as controversial as it was. And so, I have also produced individual literary works, poetry, fiction, creative, non-fiction, and audiobooks, which have not been released. I must qualify that not only explore black aesthetics, that very complex term, and tackle the post-colonial social political pathologies that afflict Africa and its diaspora, but also seek to organically bridge the boundaries between peoples and cultures. The binary, you may add, inevitably informs this lecture. As noted already, my commitment to studying street stories and culture was inspired my first as a journalist and creative writer in Nigeria. I've had to track some of the most elusive and arguably most important post-colonial texts, urban oral narratives. So the focus is on the urban center. Why are these elusive? Why are they called street stories? My approach is decidedly cosmopolitan then, asking what we might learn from urban rather than national inquiries. This represents a significant advance for post-colonial cultural studies, which to date have focused more on the nation and national narratives as the locus of meaning. Although some theorists of the post-colony have demonstrated that cities are more formative of meaning than countries, this study goes further to argue that within the post-colonial city, what identify as street stories, and by this I also think about them in terms of what we know as rumors, gossip, legends, that these encode and or decode power relations. Such work is particularly important in more oral and totalitarian societies of Africa, where freedom of speech is tenuous, or talking ubiquitous and loaded with penitential meaning. Uncertain of the right to speak openly, everyday people use traditional narrative structures to convey potentially seditious meaning. So my study then show that my approach is different from related studies which, although recognize creativity in the street, do not focus on street stories and the correlated cultural production, which includes film, music, and popular press, as epistemic discourses of post-colonial politics of illusion. Like old wine, The passage of time has enabled me to extend and refine the scope of this work to a more authoritative level. For example, a remarkable and recent part of this study is my examination of how post-colonial citizens have invented street stories about an imagined body double called Jibril from Sudan. I know some of you from Nigeria might have heard about Jibril from Sudan. Does anybody know about Jibril from Sudan? Oh, somebody does. I'm glad that somebody does. To ridicule and question the fitness of the last Ottoman Nigerian president, Muhammadu Buhari. And I will see if I have this YouTube link. Okay. So I'll get back to you at the end. Let me not interrupt this. I've extended the ideas from the streets, to my recent book, DisPlace, which I'll be reading from later, and was a finalist, as Dr. Akuma has said. Apparently, then, the title of my lecture today, Unbound Street Stories in a Diasporic World, is partly inspired by this title of this anthology. As an African proverb declares, without stories, the world will collapse. But what do I mean by these seemingly amorphous term street stories? Being a storyteller and a street philosopher whose first book is a collection of short stories, The Night Eyes with a Knife, I would like to further share the story of my journey to the topic of my lecture today. And I would ask you to just brace up a bit, because this is one of those anecdotes. In the last quarter of 1999, I traveled from Lagos to Ogidi in Anambra State, Nigeria, to visit the celebrated novelist and founder of the Association of Nigerian Authors, Professor Chinua Achebe. My trip was part of a journalistic assignment as literary editor of This Day newspaper, one of Nigeria's leading newspapers based in Lagos at the time. Within 48 hours, I was to produce a comprehensive magazine story of Achebe's homecoming after nearly a decade in exile in the United States of America. The urgency of this assignment necessitated my undertaking a perilous night bus journey from Lagos in southwestern Nigeria to Ogidi, Achebe's hometown in eastern Nigeria. It was a journey of about 480 kilometers, which due to stretches of bad road and ubiquitous police checkpoints could take up 8 hours or all night to cover. I arrived in Onitsha but before dawn. The city, known as a commercial hub of the region and birthplace of the popular Onitsha market literature, was gradually stirring to life when I arrived at the open bus terminal at Opi-Iweka. It was too early, too risky to get a connecting ride to Achebe's home in Ogidi, some 30 minutes distance from Onitsha. So I decided to hang out at a makeshift shack run by a fellow nicknamed Smokey Joe, as I soon heard his patrons hailing him. Smokey Joe vended tea, coffee, sandwiches, patent medicine, very important, alcoholic beverages, and I suspected marijuana, also known as Igbo in local parlance. It was a cold night during the rainy season, and so commuters were huddled in any available space provided by traders who were selling assorted wares, mostly food items, cigarettes, and alcoholic spirits mixed with herbs, and locally called baraga, and had small fireplaces made from charcoal crackling and generating some heat. Apparently popular at the bus stop terminals of bus stop itself was Smokey Joe's store, which was filled with travelers and homeless loafers. It soon became obvious that part of Smokey Joe's popularity rested on his astonishing skill as a storyteller, a gift he adroitly deployed to his advantage, drawing more customers to his stand. Like others, I was held captive by Smokey Joe's yarns, forgetting the discomfort of hanging out in the damp weather, sitting on an uncomfortable makeshift hard wooden bench. Between plying his trade and smoking a wrap of what smelled like weed, Smokey Joe regaled us with fantastic stories about ordinary people and Nigerians' political opportunists. Smokey Joe, like his Onitsha market literature forebears, addressed the more typical and topical tropical concerns, and I'm just posing 2 minutes, of his audience. His narrative sometimes bordered on the mythical, as was the story of the controversial death of Nigerian's last military dictator, General Sani Abacha, in the company of Indian prostitutes who fed him lethal apples. He also told a stunning story about a highway armed robbery operation on one of the commercial luxury buses in eastern Nigeria, popular for long trips across the country. According to Smokey Joe, during the robbery operation, the driver of the luxury bus was shot dead by one of the robbers who was dressed in the white robe of the clergy and had boarded the Lagos-bound luxury bus disguised as a preacher man, complete with a crucifix and the Bible. He also told another story about a greedy businessman who had patronized a voodoo priest who armed him with a talisman for success in his business. But according to Smokey Joe, the chance backfired and the businessman turned into a vulture at Opiweka roundabout there in Onitsha, a popular secular road not far from Smokey Joe's shack. Throughout, Smokey Joe, as if cognizant of the impact of the implicit outlandishness of his stories for his audience, he cited the authority of newspapers and news magazines as sources to support the veracity. Indeed, in one instance, a member of the audience challenged the authenticity of versions of some of Smokey Joe's stories. The spectator contended that it was not in an Ekerson bus, but that his preacher man robber incident took place in a Youngsha Grow bus. He also argued that the man-turned-vulture incident did not take place in Onitsha, but in Lagos. In response, Smokey Joe emphatically affirmed the veracity of his narrative, stopping short of swearing, and subsequently punctuating his narratives with the following refrain in his native Igbo language. It is written in the papers. My fateful encounter with Smokey Joe is one example of improvised reportage encountered on the street. And this is why this story is so fascinating to me, this experience, and how it has enabled me to define what happens in the street with regards to storytelling. How in the hands or in the lips or within the skills of ordinary people, simple narratives of everyday life can be made to acquire different kinds of meaning. And we have seen this play out in multiple cultural productions and formations, whether it's in the media, as in the press, and how this complex circulation takes place. So, Reuben Abati, a popular newspaper columnist and former presidential spokesperson, had a similar experience at one of the ubiquitous police checkpoints on one of the streets in Lagos. Abati reports that during the encounter with the police at the checkpoint, a policeman gave him a lecture about the biggest crooks that he had seen, the so-called people in Nigeria, the so-called big people in Nigeria. According to Abati, the policeman even cited the example of the wife of an important Nigerian who was caught shoplifting in London. And then the following instructive exchange ensued. Didn't you read it in the papers? He asked. I told him I hadn't read the particular story. Then you should read the newspaper more often. I thought you said you're a journalist. And this is an actual encounter. He reports, and he is telling one of the country's leading journalists that you should have read it in the papers because he was citing the authority of the paper. So the paper lends that kind of authority, even when the story might be purely fictional. Beyond the conventional negative understanding of the term rumor, as dramatically portrayed in much contemporary scholarship, we must begin to see it more as some positive force, a subversive weapon of resistance on the lives of everyday people. My interest in this subject is partly inspired by that more complex and alternative conception of rumor, as well as by its significance of performative function in everyday life and popular contemporary culture in the post-colonial urban social space. The need to properly characterize the often confusing communicative practice that relates to and or interchangeably used with oral literature, gossip, grapevine, and journalism have also motivated my research. My understanding of the nuanced relationship between these genres have prompted me to reconceptualize and examine these categories under the new name and the more embracing nomenclature of street stories. In the post-colonial Nigerian urban context, street stories are symptomatic of ordinary citizens' attempts to comprehend their socio-political circumstance through narratives and to promote popular uprising as much as possible against an oppressive state. One does not have to look far to find these stories in the media, on Twitter, Facebook, or YouTube. There are videos explaining at length how President Muhammadu Buhari could not possibly be enthroned from Sudan, while others spend many minutes explaining why this indeed is the case. Internet memes went viral during the 2015 elections, allowing Nigerians and journalists, in some cases, politicians themselves, to participate in every form of political storytelling. The speed with which street stories are able to proliferate now, thanks to widespread use of internet, is best amplified by a BBC article about a gorilla who swallowed 7 million naira at a zoo in Kano. Now, this will sound like a fantastical tale, but indeed, this has been given a whole lot. And there's a lot of these animal stories about how animals develop some kind of extraordinary powers, mystical powers, or swallowing money that is missing. It could be monkey, it could be any of those kind of things. And the truth is that these stories are also reproduced by ordinary people with a certain degree and a certain amount of certainty, and are ready to swear to it. The very same day the story spread across Twitter and quickly morphed into a source of hilarity, spinning off into other stories, referencing previous narratives, tying animals to the disappearance of money, and even imagining the reaction of the gorilla at being the subject of such a bizarre tale. Street stories are alive and well in Nigeria, though they rarely seem to get the attention and theorizing they deserve from humanities scholars. And this is... I haven't accidentally closed. That's exactly what So there's this image that I thought, yeah. So you actually swallowed 6.3 million naira. And that's, you can see the conversation with the gorilla. Yes, where else could I have kept the money? You know, I don't wear Babariga. Babariga is very, is a toga, associated with politicians and very rich politicians, the flowing gown, which is one. And this has morphed into a cartoon. And then you can see that conversation. Part of my scholarly agenda is to create better understanding of these slippery, fugitive, and residual forms. These are the terms used by Karim Baba, the foremost scholar on African popular culture. Tracing them throughout almost 30 years of Nigerian's political history, from the dictatorial regimes of Babangida to Muhammadu Buhari to most recent dictatorial days. I'm going to skip through some of this, but I just want to note that I'd like to note that it is clear that those narratives passed on via conversations and bus stops, in pubs or online, have real political clout and meaning in the everyday lives of urban population. Not only do street stories leave traces in journalism and on various online forums or fora, they are also implicated in cultural production, inspiring music, film, protest art, and increasingly digital innovations. And I'm quoting Adegoju here, 2015. Many of the street stories that I am very interested in, or that we can recall, sometimes have a form, whether they're in films, and then bravely to choose to make explicit what James C. Scott calls hidden transcripts, and speak truth to power at times when it is dangerous and politically level to do so. It has been quite some time since my encounter with Smokey Joe, yet the stories he peddles remain familiar in their outrageous nature in their form and subversive character. In focusing on the controversial street discourses which so define Nigerian history, I align my interest with Carolyn Bassett's defense of narratives, which is what she calls it, as a vital element of contemporary culture, lying at the heart of processes through which humans make sense of everyday lived experiences that are, by virtue of their mediation through and across information, increasingly multi-layered and complex both temporally and spatially. But what are street stories exactly? Street stories are complex oral texts, essentially produced and circulated by citizens of a state who occupy what Obi Baba in the location of culture describes as liminal space within the post-colonial power equation and other settings. This liminal space covers both the material and the invisible, that shadowed zone between the oral and the written world. Even ever mutative street stories often assume the form of astonishing narratives or anecdotes by which subaltern seeks to speak truth to power or to interrogate social, political, and economic developments. Denied access to centers of power, traditional media, and other formal or institutionalized channels of authoritative discourses, some less privileged residences of the city often resort to extra-institutional strategies, such as spinning complex verbal texts in different narrative forms. Some of the texts are allegorical or mythical, while others are satirical and humorous. Still others are both visual and textual and easily shareable online, ultimately contributing to the perception that I quote Silva Resti, what constitutes political participation has been broadened to include mundane practices, such as commenting on political blogs and posting jokes about politicians. Street stories may come in the form of rumors, wild theories, conspiracy theories, or an amalgam of realistic and fantastic or mythical tales woven into compelling tapestries, sustaining the interest of passers-by on the street. Gossip websites or WhatsApp chats, which has even become a more popular platform for circulating these kind of stories. The stories swing between the personal narratives and the talk of the town stories derived from other sources, including community media. And some of you know this community media. You know, they just exist almost in every space where individuals get together and can spin somebody's yarn and aim at interpreting social reality, especially in the post-colonial context, as Mbebe would say. They are related to, but differ from, Jason Harris's deployment of rumors as assuming, quote, a very special role in professionalized politics, where communication experts should really read the new convergence culture and use rumor to try to steer political discourse via intermedia agendas, end of quote. So rather than street stories, they are also fluid and ever mutating, brimming with absurd energy. My core proposition is that by proceeding such hybrid texts, these disadvantaged citizens try to fill the liminal lacunae in the communicative process between conventional media and themselves. And I have this section on, I'm looking at the time, on what I call rumors as tests and the political everyday life. And this deals with how rumors are also used as forms of political weapon. And we have seen this play out in the form of conspiracy theories, even most recently in United States politics, where I will speak a bit more towards the end of this presentation. So these definitions of rumor point to its nebulous nature and universality. As Kimmel notes, with any desired bit of information instantaneously available with a click of a computer mouse, we might expect that rumors or street stories which traditionally have flourished during periods of news blackouts and information famines will be a thing of the past. Ironically, the opposite seems to be the case. In contemporary society, rumors circulate like the air we breathe. More and more, they seem to arise not from a lack of information, but within a context of information overload. This apparent contradiction can be traced in large to the public's seemingly insatiable need to know. As demands for greater access to news and instantaneous communication continue to grow, the reliability of any one piece of information has become that much more difficult to access. End of quote. Kimball's characterization of rumor not only reflects its universal application, it also highlights its ambiguity in everyday usage. It is hard to define as it is to trace back to the original source. The transposition of rumors into various forms in the mass media raises the significance for popular culture scholar like me, interested in the popular press in a post-colonial setting where orality is still vital to interpretation and corporate everyday communications. So much so that bureaucratic Nigeria, word of mouth sometimes carries more weight than written communication. Indeed, part of the post-colonial bureaucratic practice in Nigeria is a tendency of important appointments and dismissals in public office to circulate first via street stories, with the appointee hearing for the first time as rumor, then in the news or radio television before possibly getting an official letter. This phenomenon can be summed up under the concept of IM, an abbreviation for Imamado, literally knowing someone, an Igbo term that connotes being connected or having long legs in inflation society, social ties. It sometimes determines official privileges and implies a level of intimacy that enables face-to-face communication, imbues it with commanding compulsion of proximity, as Gordon and Moloch would say, with social capital, and affirms, and I quote, the moral economy of ethnicity, often rarely a moral economy of the kinship group, has developed civic traditions and in particular sentiments of solidarity and business confidence. Rooted in this kind of cultural economy, therefore, I understand street stories are striking an unusual note, well worth paying serious attention. A remarkable experience that I had interviewing a leading Nigerian journalist and media executive illustrates the narrative knowledge inherent in street stories and throws more light on the problematic relationship between the kind of street stories that the Smoky Joe peddles and the touted fact is sacred dictum of journalism. As part of my ethnographic studies, I interviewed Dan Agbese, founding executive of Newswatch, one of Nigeria's earliest news magazines. I asked Mr. Agbese, then executive editor, what the experience had been with reporters providing story ideas, the weekly editorial conferences over which he presides. Mr. Agbese, known for his deadpan humor and periodic sentences, recalled occasional encounter with young reporters who, in response, and then you're going to hear this, who, in response to the usual question about the sources of their story ideas for the week, would gladly announce, the story is everywhere. That's on the streets talk of town or talk of town. In other words, in a reverse form or provenance of the street stories which Smoky Joe identified, the news reporters were citing the authority of the Smoky Joes, purveyors of such street oral narratives, as the source of their news story ideas. Such a complex, if oppositional, interface between the oral and the written in relation to the everyday circulation of street stories emerged in bolder relief. And then I'll just skip. For me, the narratives of Smoky Joe, Abati, and even Dan Agbese offer a handle for theorizing the kind of improvised orality and scribal journalism interfaces that implicate everyday life and exist on the margins of mainstream political memories. And so within this hybrid, there is this tendency to and so in many cases, I hope to say this. So the state, instruments of power, the state is also aware about the potency of street stories that in some cases efforts are actually made as censorship and at ways in which to discourage everyday people from participating in the production and circulation of street stories. And this is a real notice or signpost posted in a city. If I was posted in Asaba and I found this, it's been taken down, but I got a photo. And then look at it, don't peddle rumors, only seek the truth. And look at the source. Courtesy, Ministry of Information. Delta State, which is one of the states in Nigeria. The significance of street stories as a tool for political resistance can be gleaned from the state's regular press conference or press statement discouraging rumor mongering. In extreme cases, billboards are posted at conspicuous locations in the city showing a citizen with a shut up sign over his lips and declaring, "Stop spreading rumors around." And this is a tribute to the viral, spiral, and recycled nature of street stories. During an election, those press statements have shifted to demonizing instead fake news. A media assistant to the Nigerian president warned that fake news kills people. And this is a media assistant, I'm not joking, it's real. He says fake news kills people. At the same time, he suggested that outing the peddlers of fake news, though they are undeniably everywhere, and to some extent all of us, would help to solve the problem. Hence, it strings together a push-pull dynamic between official state narratives and those that emerge from the streets. I'm interested in how these streets open up an alternative expression of civic responsibilities, justice, and individual rights in the context of post-colonial states' application of social contract in the urban space. What forms of empowerment and social justice emerge when ordinary citizens gather in pubs, commercial vehicles, on Twitter, around public municipal vending stands, and other offline or online arenas of socialization in the public sphere, and conduct impromptu mock trials of rulers and traditions of human rights. So I argue that although the popular narrative resistance may not always be consciously programmatic exercise by the people, the Nigerian experience proves otherwise, as exemplified by the June 12 struggle and the first exit of the dictator, General Sani Abacha, on 27 August 1993. In the Nigerian context, street narratives reinforced by a rhizomic circulation process that sees them creeping underground into the popular press and other forms of popular culture production have sometimes destabilized sovereign power. So, while acknowledging the idea of the individual art in Western society in the form of verbal arts or poetry, singing, storytelling, I recognize the contemporary anthropologist's vision of collective anonymous art, as Ntoju would say. I am both interested in the creative agency of the Smoky Joes as oral artists in their own right and in the alternative creative spaces as a site of cultural participation and production in the African post-colony. Beyond the foregoing prefatory exploration of my road to the topic of this lecture, I would like to use the last part of this lecture to further clarify the idea of unbound stories in a diasporic world. And I'm just in the last part of my presentation. The significance of alternative creative space as a site of cultural participation and production of unbound street stories, not just in the African post-colonial, but in African diasporic world, needs not to be overemphasized. Beyond the social space, where street stories are performed, these stories triangulate around the fantastic compass of the griot, the magic relics, protocols of the fiction narrator or novelist, and the ostensible historical accuracy of news reports or journalists. Much of what I call street stories are now transmitted through multiple channels as willing migrants of the new African diaspora share their stories via social media and streaming sites. And I use the term New African Diaspora in a more professionalized sense, in which scholars have begun to pay attention or create a kind of dichotomy between the early migrants, what do you call them now? People who were moved to the diasporas through slavery. So unwilling, that's what I was looking, unwilling, when we forced. So we now have willing migrants that include people like Nduka Otiono, who have come out of their own volition for one reason or the other to these parts of the world to either raise family or live, or even in sometimes temporary sojourn and to go back. So the idea of globalization and migration has become so complicated that in discussions about New African diaspora, it's important to look at that complex tapestry. where every individual has their own stories about what brought them to this part of the world. And so much of what I call, beyond the social space where street stories are performed, these stories triangulate around the fantastic compass of the girl, the magical realist protocols of the fiction narrator or novelist, and the ostensible historical accuracy of news report by journalists. Much of what I call street stories are now transmitted through multiple channels, as willing migrants of the new African diaspora share their stories via social media and streaming sites. The Japan phenomenon has inspired new writing from a younger generation of writers. And this is very fascinating because we're already speaking in terms of Japan literature. The nascent reality of immigration literature. These are some new content, these are some new terms that have been emerged in our vocabulary to describe the forms of cultural production in the literary space that's taking place. Immigration literature. And then in the context of Nigeria and the Nigerian diaspora, oftenly known as Japan literature that has limited Nigerian poetry and prose in recent years have provided a platform for the production and circulation of street stories. So too have digital content creators utilized the accessibility of digital media to transmit various kinds of fantastical comedic skits, sometimes laced with the most stunning street lore. And I'm sure some of you may be active consumers of some of these content creation, without necessarily, in some cases, just enjoying them and not even having any critical distance in looking at them. Part of the survival of diaspora citizens and their connection with the homeland has been in the consumption of these forms of cultural production. The love for homeland and the distance from homeland have made the contemporary diaspora, a very fertile ground for this to flourish. And so every now and then, we see artists who have established reputation in the homeland visit the diaspora, and then, to big hits. And in a way that I find really fascinating, and I think this is so compelling, some of the most positive news about the homeland come from artists. They are the ones who are winning the Grammys. And so they represent some of the highest quality of citizens in the post-colonial state, and even in the diaspora. And so, unfortunately, we do not have all the time to explore this at this lecture this evening. However, suffice it to note that this is an emerging phenomenon that has caught my interest with work on the anthology, Unbound, an anthology of new Nigerian poets under 40. And a lot of these poets live in the diaspora. Some of them are products of the writing programs in Ivy League and very distinguished American and Canadian institutions, especially in North America, where there has been a shift in more recent times from Europe to North America. And as a matter of fact, Canada, where I live now, is a beautiful bride of many Japa-interested citizens of the post-colonial state in Nigeria to come to. However, suffice to say that this is a emerging phenomenon that has caught my interest with work on the anthology. I find quite instructive Kushaki Adams' poignant observation that, and I quote, as more people turn to social networks as a primary news source, transmission models combined with appropriate data could help in exploring the dynamics of this new media landscape. In the fake news, alternative facts, conspiracy theories, and the post-truth era of President Donald Trump, the boundaries between these subgenres appear to have shrunk to the extent that make the kind of street stories revealed by Smokey Joe look more respectable. On this note, I would like to end with a reading from DisPlace, my collection of poems, which has been praised for its exploration of mobility and migration as major concerns in a diasporic world. And that ends that formal part of the presentation. And I just want to share this with you. It's a long poem, but I'm just going to read parts of it. And this is particularly poignant because I wrote this, one of the earliest poems I wrote when I moved to Canada. And there were some really, really crazy days. Having to deal with the kind of cold. I soon realized that being a tourist around the world is different from living in a place. And so if you visited Villanova in the winter and spent a couple of days, I'm probably chaperoned by a Kunle or a Chiji. It's going to be different if you stayed back on your own and feel the bitter winter and navigate yourself. And so, being a visitor, as I had been as a journalist, traveled very extensively. Living in North America, living in Canada was a different experience, and I found myself responding to that environment within the diaspora context. So the title of this poem is Paint the Sky. And I also thought to share a bit of this other part of me, which I consider actually more important to me than scholarship, which is creative writing. Paint the Sky is a wet, breezy Friday night, and I will paint the sky tonight, inspired by my raincoat jacket. A raincoat that reminds me of the summer feel of condoms. I'm in an Edmonton bar alone, dreaming of homeland and magazine with all the stars, pepper soup, and the oboa salad that Friday night offers. Inside rats, there are no rats. The bar is clean like a newly shaved chin. But instead of the fragrance of aftershave, the smell of tobacco hangs in the air, suffocating desire with nicotine. And I, a troubadour, am perched on a stool with spindly legs like the stilts of some African masquerade facing the window. Outside, Edmonton is a tortured splash of incandescent bulbs. From my glassy hotspot, I see angels of darkness in flight with no compass to locate my condo shadowed somewhere in the horizon, wherein I've grown weary from keeping vigils for a dreadful winter. As each day glides past with expectations of nature's frozen temper, tonight I see red in the air, for red is a freedom road. Oshafison says, and red is rat's star outlined in a hue of blue that reminds me of hurrying cumulus outside. I will paint the sky tonight when the clouds are spread out like the wings of an eagle in mid-flight. I see floating atop the watery film of my favorite beverage pictures of Edmonton's rousing skyline, but cannot find buried in her valley a river of peace. At West End, clouds gather like wolves drifting towards the room at the top, which is what rat represents. Inside the bar, Edmonton is a chatter of tongues converging from distant climes on this Friday night. But between power plant and rat, there are no signs of Joel with bagger and his advance party, poets on a mission to pour libations to their muse. Now in this suspended bar, lonely, I wander through a maze of temptations, beckoning like Irish cream and thinking of special Thanksgiving turkeys and the festivities in the air. For tonight, I shall paint the sky, inspired by my raincoat jacket. A raincoat that reminds me of the summer feel of condoms. Alone in this Edmonton bar, I dream of homeland and all the guns and crude oil in combat in the Niger Delta. Thank you very much. So I guess it's question time. Or comments? I'm happy to take questions. Yes, over to you.
Sorry, I just thought it would be a little easier if I come around with a microphone to anyone who'd like to ask a question, share a thought, or comment. So, yes, please.
Thank you so much. I had just a clarifying question. I was hearing you say that rumors maybe connect people or allow people to participate in a social network. Is that right? And if so, can you talk more about it?
Yeah, I'd use the word slippery and fugitive category to describe rumors and gossip. And those are terms that come from the foremost scholar of African popular culture, Karim Baba, who had, defining popular culture in Africa, had identified how difficult it is to define those terms. And rumors happens to be one of them, because rumors is one term that fits into different disciplinary fields. It's in mass communication, as some of you might know, and then it's in everyday usage. And it becomes even more problematic in everyday usage. What are rumors? If we ask ourselves a very simple question, what is a rumor? You're going to say it's word of mouth. You're going to say it's a story that you've heard and it's not been confirmed or proven. But the fascination for me is how complex it is, how slippery it is, and how it is actually so difficult to apprehend. And then alongside that is the idea of seeking its provenance. In trying to track the beginning of the stories or of a rumor, it just goes away. I had so many quotes about rumors. I say, don't ask me. One of them is, don't ask me the source of the story. I don't know. And in some cases as well, the rumors take the life of their own. So you plant a seed, and then it just begins to have different versions. And so, in terms of sharing of rumors, and then in terms of the stakes, the political angle to it is very important to me. And I'll give you one of Nigerians' most circulated rumors, and that's the idea that General Sani Abacha died in the hands of Indian prostitutes. There's no proof to that. And this has been reproduced in films, in music, in cartoons. It is so pervasive that this street version of this particular experience, or this particular incident, has superseded the state and official autopsy, which says that, I can't even remember what it is. That's how bad it is. Yeah, I can't remember. Can you remember what it is? Heart attack or something like that. And so there is that kind of opposition and the contest. And that's where I look at it as a political weapon, where people use that, in some cases, outrightly lies invented by some people as punishment for bad actors. And so they just create those stories. And so the association in terms of network also does relate to beliefs or ideological school bents. Does that clarify the point? Yeah, thank you.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm piggybacking off of this question, going back to your initial image, all right? I'm always interested in gorillas that eat money.
Yeah.
But the circular dynamic of that in thinking about diaspora are people who eat pets. And so, to your question, all right, part of the issue of rumors and their power and their political strength, all right, goes to the idea of their repetition and the ways in which they can be employed over scale to do the particular task. And there are communities that will understand that they are rumors in and of themselves, but that they have particular purpose. So back to President Abacha, if we do not like him, then he died at the hands of Indian prostitutes. If we do like him, then he just passed away in a quiet moment, and this was all it was about. Yes. But it links people, and part of the linking of people is a political project, and we've just seen that political project here. So rumors, even when people tell you that they are lying, have their own power.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate this parallel that you've drawn. And because we can use that story of the pets, they're eating the pets, and to see the spin-offs, you see how a single statement can evolve into different cultural productions. And if you had followed I've seen some in fact, in some cases, within hours of the debate, there were different representations of that experience. And I'm not sure I want to regale you with some of them, but there's lots of them on YouTube. And so that's about how this cultural, how they travel. I call them traveling texts. Because and then they can just go through, in some cases, they can go to the entire gamut of cultural production. whether it's film, cartoons, you're going to find various versions of them by individuals who have stake in those stories or in a particular experience, and so understand how political it is and why they have to engage with it. And then in many cases, actually satirizing them. And I see how the diaspora sometimes, despite the sense of advancement, you talk about the advanced world and the developing world, right? The global north and the global south dichotomies. How at the end of the day, the human experience for the consumption, for aesthetics and consumption of narratives is a common experience. And individuals, you think, live in highly technologized societies, actually depend on some of those basic aspects of the circulation of narrative to participate in either political or social processes. Thank you for bringing that up.
More questions, comments, thoughts?
I can read another poem if somebody wants to think about that.
That'd be great, yeah.
So I'm going to read one of the poems that the first part of this book, the poems which constitute my newer poems, are shorter and elegiac, they're sad poems. And one of them is a coronavirus poem, and is entitled A Chain of Requiems for the multitudes who perished in the time of the coronavirus. In this season of the contagion, life is an antiseptic street of hand sanitizers, bereft of handshakes, kisses, or hugs. In this sterile season of the contagion, life is a chain of requiems. They have vanished without farewells, buried hurriedly amidst silent funerals. Kings and subjects in emergency graves, no bellman to toll for these braves who fought lonely in their corona suffering. Coronavirus corrodes the world with untimely disappearances, dispensing grief like a sadist. In a comb without brief, as time absconds, life tumbles down, down an hourglass of mourning. That's that. It's a very short poem, and one of the things I found so incredible about the contagion was that maybe at the last count, I'm not so sure where it was, but at least over 6.5 billion people died. And when I teach, sometimes when I share this poem, in Ottawa, where I live, numbers sometimes are just abstract. They just exist. We can talk about streets that were, bereft of hugs and kisses. Sterile streets. But when we convert these numbers to parallels, and I say to my students that the number of people who died, and that's counted by coronavirus, is the population of Ottawa where we live 6 times. Then it just sinks in. Ottawa is a city of about 1.3 million people. And I think on the entire city, people in the entire city 6 times perish. But the untold part of that conversation is the kind of vaccine apartheid against Africa and the doomsday prophecy that never came to light, where one of the poorest parts of the world became the most resilient part of the world against the virus, where people live their lives as if there was no pandemic. And the expectations that there will be millions of people every day just didn't happen. Lockdowns were not fully implemented. And, if you know a city like Lagos, I think you would have a very good research thinking about how you can operate lockdown in a city like Lagos with this growing population. But then poetry is one thing, and you can't make poetry out of death. But at least it just helps us to make those reflections. reflections. I have no intention of bringing grief into this room today. But while you were thinking about it, I thought that the idea of grief could make somebody ask another question or make a comment. Yes, I succeeded.
You did, yeah. So I was thinking about this for a while, and I want to share a conversation that I had with a Nigerian cousin about 17 years ago, and then ask you a question related to this. So I lived in Nigeria as a kid, and for 3 out of the 5 years that we lived there, one of my second cousins on my dad's side lived with us and shared a room with my brother and I for 3 years after his father had passed away from throat cancer. And so this cousin of mine who was a bit more like an older brother in a way, he moved from Nigeria to London to the UK, I should say, in about 2005 or 2006. And so I remember meeting up with him in London in 2007. And I hadn't seen him in years at this point, and this was his first time living out of Nigeria. And I remember asking him what he missed the most about home. And I was fully expecting him to say something like the nice, warm, tropical weather or the food. And he did not mention the food because he was living with his brother who was Nigerian, and they were eating Nigerian food at home. And he didn't mention the weather because it was summer. But the thing that he said that he missed the most was the fun of the street, just street life, and kind of moving around Lagos, and the way people interact with each other, and the stories that you hear on the street, and the fun of like riding in a crowded danfo in Nigeria and dealing with the insane traffic. And he's like, life is just so dead, like and too sanitized, right, in the UK. And we had a good laugh about it, but I was wondering if you could comment a little bit on two things. One, the ways in which some of these stories and street stories have been a way of kind of connecting diaspora and immigrant experiences with the home country experiences, number one. And number two, the way in which the culture of this street story has probably been reinforced but also altered by technological change and globalization and the social media and things like that. I'm sort of really curious to hear your anecdotes, because this business of street stories was very much alive and well in the 1980s, when Nigeria was not particularly Americanized and people didn't have access to like videos on whatever WhatsApp and YouTube and things like that. So yeah.
Wow, that's quite a very, very touching and deep one. I could go on and on. The impact. If there's a certain kind of illogicality about cities, certain cities that are just so infectious. There is that crossroads in Addis Ababa. Does anyone remember what it's called? That crossroad in Addis Ababa that you have, there's no traffic lights. And you're going to find people at breakneck speed making their turns successfully without hitting one another. I forget that now. So the point is, if you cities have their own character. And cities can be addictive. And then especially cities with specific character like Lagos, which you have in songs, celebrated in songs by Fela Kuti, and then more recently by Wizkid, say Ojo Elegba, for example. And you carry the idea of cities and locations. The most fascinating part for me is how you might live a city physically, or you live in it, in your mind. Almost on a daily basis, you live it within your mind. And you are constantly making comparisons. So to use a not so cool parallel. You grow up in a city where, for example, you can be said to be very poor hygiene, right? And people can be driving on a highway and they can just stop somewhere and have some fresh air in different kinds of ways and then just move on. So you don't have a McDonald's, and you don't have what you have is shacks, pepper soup joint. The idea of a joint has no parallel with a pub. I can't see how you can equate a pub with a joint. Gigi, is that possible? No. But they are the same places, they're pubs. A pub is a public place where you can have a drink, but a joint has a distinct character. One, the kind of people who come in there. And so a friend of ours wrote a poem. And he moved to London. And then I think from there he was, comparing and contrasting. And he has this line that says, outside this heaven or the buka, life is snobbish, like a 5-star hotel. I mean, you just imagine, outside this heaven or the buka, life is snobbish, like a 5-star hotel. So here you have two unlike, spaces being compared, and one being preferred to the other being given a pejorative explanation. And this happens with immigrants. It happens with, diaspora, especially new diaspora, where you're a willing migrant, so to speak. You have immigrated. But you carry, in one of my poems, I say that you carry the homeland like the shell of a tortoise or the shell of a mollusk. It's just that it's like a protective shell that connects you constantly. And then you're in this beautiful 5-star hotel, but you're missing one crazy joint where there's a mama put, and instead of cheese, you're smelling this fresh amala or this fresh, you know what? Yeah. I mean, these are the kind of images. So deep down, that longing for home has also led to the proliferation of these forms of cultural production, where individuals just flee through. And then the biggest addiction has come from the shots, all these reels. You're going to just find, and if you have no discipline, and that's why many people put in screen time, you would have spent hours on end from one reel to the other. And then just imagine yourself living in Lagos or Ibadan or all those kind of places with some of these skits and some of these stories. And for many people who live in the diaspora, the new African diaspora inhabitants or immigrants, that connection is so vital. And I think that's what's happening to you, or the kind of thing that has happened. Mm-hmm. Why is it so important that connection is maintained? Sometimes it's just a sheer longing, because existential realities make it so difficult to make the travel home all the time. And so there has to be a spiritual connection through the narratives, through those stories. And then how come you think that the technology, just like I've said, in terms of technology, you think, okay, but we have more access. You have a comparative. Mm-hmm. You can look at various news media. And why do you still choose to believe that? That they are eating their pets, or that this gorilla here. And you're a professor, and you're like, but you see, again, that brings in a different angle. The human love for fantasy. That fantastic tale makes it so interesting that one part of you says it might not be true, but the other part says, well, even if it's not true, but it's a very interesting story. And I think it makes a whole lot of interesting reading. So the longing for home is one that defies every kind of logic of, the well-cultured societies where we live. And then you see people still dreaming about a childhood when they splashed in the rain. where, childhood innocence, and people are not, in fact, there's just so much. So the idealization of the past, of that experience, is something that continues to fascinate me. And I wish I could write a whole lot more about that past in a way that is not just so idealized, but also allow us to make political critique of the parts of that system that are just not working. And recently, a Nigerian who lives in the UK, who occupies some kind of position, has come under attack. Cancel culture, because she has used some very disparaging terms about a country. And then, so you think about what I also call offshore and onshore consumption of material, of cultural production. And then sometimes the kind of resentment that those in the homeland have for those in the diaspora. And I think that's a different conversation altogether.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Questions, thoughts? Yeah, please. If you don't mind introduce yourself, that would be great too.
Hello, my name is Major. And my question, not so much a question, but more so almost like a comment. You said you experienced Nigerian street life through stories, and I just wanted to say, like, I feel like I also experience like different cultures, not through stories, but more so through soccer. I've been playing soccer all my life, and I've been exposed to a lot of different cultures through it, especially a lot with Cameroon, Senegal, and with Nigeria. And I noticed that every single country, every single city has like a different way of playing soccer that reflects like the life from that city or from that country. So I was just gonna ask, like, what is the style, so to say, not necessarily of soccer, but what is like the style or the ambiance of Lagos or Nigeria that I guess that you can explain?
Okay, I like that question because it gives me a chance to speak to something that I would have skipped. So we talk about culture, and we talk about space, and we talk about location, the location of culture, right? If I told you that if you went to the National Stadium in Lagos, Nigeria, where there is no snow, and there's never snow, and you're going to find some of the most incredible skaters, would you believe that? Well, it's true. You're going to find young people in the streets who are skating, who are doing, and where they imagine. In fact, there's a story, if you check online, you probably find that about these Kenyan young people who became nationals, international skating champions, who live in the tropics. I just imagine that. So in the cities, say like Lagos, it has its own distinct character. And it's not peculiar to Lagos. It's probably associated with Global South, where you're going to find young children who become international soccer stars in Argentina, in all of those places, in Lagos, in the ghetto, who grew up playing soccer on top of filth, in filthy streets. I don't know what it is about cities or about creation and about talent. But it seems to me, and I like to say this all the time, one of the equalizing elements of life that gives the most wretched of the earth opportunity to make a living is talent. There's never a shortage of talent in the most unlikely places. And this happens in soccer. One of the world's fastest growing soccer stars today is the Nigerian footballer. What's his name? Osimhen. Victor.
Yeah.
And recently, he visited Nigeria and went to the secondary school or high school where he studied to give back. And he was like a hero. And where's the place in Oregon? In Lagos. Oregon is, until recently used to be one of those small neighborhoods, because the rich part of the city now is in the island, Victoria Island and all those places. And so these people evolve a certain kind of lifestyle that is unique to them and that defies logic. And so the kind of soccer, to be more specific to what you say, is almost soccer as a brawl. Because for some of those kids, their gateway to success in life is soccer. So you can imagine somebody who has placed his entire hope in becoming the next Victor Osimhen on soccer. It's almost like a life and death thing. You're going to see them playing, even with a cut. They'll use pants to play, because in some cases they can afford it. So it has a brutal color that is beautiful. I don't know how I can explain that. It has a brutal color that is beautiful. And then you're going to find, like this guy, I've shut down the computer. But if you check online and say the Nigerian supporter says all of us will die on the line, there was this viral video about a Nigerian athlete who was participating in one of these international athletic runs. And against all odds, he qualified for the finals. And he was being interviewed. And, in the interview, they asked him, so what happened? Are you surprised? And he said, yes, that he was surprised and that he had worked hard. And that, as he was running, and he was saying this in Nigerian pidgin, that the wind was against him, but he had to run and run and run. And then that he actually emerged, as a winner. And they said, so what's going to happen in the next round? Now you're going up to the finals. And he said that for this race, all of us are going to die on the line. For him, it was like, look, I'm going to win this race or it's going to be death. So that's the kind of distinction they're going to find with these people in these places that creates that kind of color that, as I said, is brutally beautiful. One of my earliest assignments as a journalist in Lagos was to cover, and I chose to that the ghettos, Lagos ghettos. So I know Lagos ghettos inside out, because in some cases I spent nights in some of them, and I wrote that piece. There's a place called Makoko, one of the most photographed spaces in Lagos by foreign journalists, who would rather not go to Banana Island. You're going to see mansions all over the place. But Nollywood has shown the kind of mansions there, not only in Lagos, but in Ghana and many other places. That does not show only the ugliness of the continent, but shows some of its beauty. That do not define us by our ugliness. And then you see that with international journalists. So while I was in Nigeria, if you took them to DI, no, they are not interested. That's not where they want to cover. And they're going to be blunt. That's not, we want to go to those places like Makoko, where houses are built on top of stilts at a lagoon, and the sanitary conditions are nothing to write home about. Out of those slums have emerged sports gems, music stars from the ghettos, and the same thing to some extent in the United States. If you think about some of the pop stars, their backgrounds from the project and how the project became a central part of hip hop, and what some people aggressively called black noise. So thanks for that question. You can have a whole lot of. Remember, I said I'm a storyteller. I love to tell stories. So, yeah. I hope that answers your question, or at least the response to your comment.
Awesome. We got time for one more question. So who'd like to ask? Last question or last comment? All right. So I'd like to thank Dr. Otiono for being with us today and for sharing his wisdom and thoughts and insights. And I'd also like to thank all of you for being a really fantastic audience. Feel free to help yourself to goodies, and there's lots of gluten-free options at the back if you need that. And wish everybody a good night and good rest of your week. Thank you.
Thank you.